Welcome to our second Ezra seminar system talk for this semester. So you know that this seminar is organized really to offer you a system perspective. Actually, it's anything we do. Actually, you do see that in the system perspective. Today, actually, we are very delighted to have Professor Allison Godwin. So actually, Allison, she is the urban 67-68 professor in engineering education research. So you probably go to a lot of classes and which are taught by the professors doing all this kind of research. But have you ever thought about engineering education research? Actually, this is such an important topic. Actually, so Allison, she is the urban engineering education research professor and also in our school of chemical and biomedical engineering. And she is also serving as Associate Director of the Cornell Nanoscale Science and Technology Facility. So actually, if you visit her website, you see that actually she has won a lot of awards. Of course, she's won the Career Award, which is for the early career development for faculty, which is really a prestigious award. And the more important thing is that actually here at the Cornell, in the Cornell community, we're so excited to have her because she really brings a very important angle that will benefit all the professors in the college, in the university, and also most importantly, all of you, the students. So basically today, I think, Allison, we're looking forward to a talk today to talk about identity, motivation, and also belonging development in the engineering education environment. Allison, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm excited to be here. And you may or may not know that engineering education research is a new strategic priority and investment area in the College of Engineering. So I'm one of three. I am not the only faculty member here on campus that does this work now in the College of Engineering. I have a colleague in biomedical engineering, Alexandra Worth, and a colleague that is joint between systems and chemical and biomolecular engineering, Alexander Koso-Strom. So it's fun to be here and to share a little bit about this, but it's a very different application than many of you have probably thought about for systems. So you might be wondering, how do you become an engineering education researcher? Great question. So I'll tell you a little bit about me and how I got here. I have a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, which makes sense of why I'm in the chemical and biomolecular engineering department. And I always thought I was going to go into the pharma industry, and that was going to be my life for 40 years plus, and that was my engineering goal. But my plans changed. We can always talk about why that was. But I took a sharp left turn when I found out that engineering education was a research field that existed. And it's a relatively young research field as far as credentialed degree programs go. The first one was started in 2004, about 20 years old at this point, although engineering education research as a practice has been around for a lot longer. And one of my major professional societies, the American Society for Engineering Education, has been around for over 125 years. But I did my graduate degree at Clemson as well in engineering and science education. That was not in the College of Education. That was actually in the College of Engineering and Science. So I took 18 credit hours of graduate chemical engineering coursework, but I also married that with a social science set of coursework and perspectives that gave me the opportunities and the tools to take my engineering way of thinking and the tools from engineering and apply them to a social science set of questions. I finished my grad degree and joined Purdue University in a tenure-track job. I started off in the School of Engineering Education. It was a 100% appointment, and over the years, the Chemie department decided that I was worth hanging out with too, so that I became joint with chemical engineering while I was there, and earned tenure at Purdue. I was there for 9.5 years and started up my research program, which is called STRIDE, which stands for Shaping Transformative Research on Identity and Diversity in Engineering, which you'll hear a lot more about today. And one of the big things I did, and we won't talk much about today, is I was part of an engineering research center there, focused on shale oil resources and next generation energy transitions in the United States. And I led their workforce development efforts. And the 5 years I was there, we had impact on over 40,000 K-12 students, 1,500 K-12 teachers, number of REU students, and about 150 graduate students as well. I became tenured in 2020. I also have involvement with one of our educational journals, Chemical Engineering Education. And in 2023, I moved here to Cornell to help found and start up some of this work in engineering education as a part of the college's priorities, and joined the other journal that is one of our flagship journals in our field, the Journal of Engineering Education. And as you heard, I've also engaged with CNF, mostly because of that workforce development role. So if you're like, why is she in Nano? I'm working on the workforce development side of that effort, and with the CHIPS and Science Act, this is a huge growing effort in the United States. I'm happy to talk about all of that, but I'm going to focus more on what I consider more my fundamental research today. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think of my work is kind of divided into 4 areas. I have my fundamental research on how do humans develop in education systems. That's what I'm going to focus a lot on today, but that has implications for what do we do in practice. And so thinking about what are practices that we can develop from what we know in research, and how do we test their efficacy and for whom they work and why. I have that engineering workforce development hat, and then I have a building capacity hat in thinking about supporting people in skilling up in engineering education research as a younger field, as well as faculty in thinking about how to apply practices in their own teaching and education. And that's my role with the McCormick Teaching Excellence Institute here on campus as well. And so I'm not going to lecture at you for 45 minutes. I want a little bit of engagement here. And I want to start off the talk by kind of seeding this idea about what does it mean to be an engineer. So what do you think of when you hear that word?
There are problems.
Problem solver, absolutely. Other things you think of?
Mathematics?
Mathematics, often fundamentals that we care deeply about and apply to the world. Other things?
Specialization.
Specialization, we become deep experts in our topic areas and applications. Other things? What about who is an engineer? I asked that question. Any thoughts on that? What kind of person is an engineer?
Creative but analytical.
Creative but analytical, I like that, yeah. Other things? One more hand, excellent.
Connect technology with some problem.
Connect technology with problems that we're solving, absolutely. So all of these things are great answers, and they're coming from an expert audience. When I Google the word engineer in a Google image search, this is what I get. What do you notice about these pictures? There's a lot of hard hats going on here. Yeah, absolutely. What else do we see? A lot of hard hats, a lot of people looking at plans. What other things do you see here?
All of it is hands-on.
Yeah, all of people like doing hands-on work, but a lot of us, myself included, do a lot of work at computer terminals, programming and other types of applications. Anything else you notice? Hi, Gina.
Many of them are collaborating.
Yeah, there is collaboration being shown here. People are working together. Anything else you see?
Most of them are men.
Most of them are men, yeah. That one usually comes up if I probe long enough. There's a lot of guys. This has changed over the years as I have Googled image search engineer. There are more women over the years. But if we still look across this, there are not a lot of representations of women or Black, Latiné, and Indigenous individuals shown here. And so this is a pretty limited scope of what it means to be an engineer that's in the kind of social milieu or what people think about when they think of the word engineer. And so that brings me to this idea of like stereotypes. Stereotypes just exist in the air. I'm not sure if you remember back in 2015, the Twitter programmer initiative that I am an engineer that was put out there by Isis Anshali. But she was critiqued in a computer science ad that she wasn't a real engineer. And she and other women posted tons of pictures of them as engineers, but also who they were in their daily life to try to combat the stereotype that an engineer is often a white, male, nerdy dude who is very specifically focused on some technical aspect. They said, we're broader than that. We're humans as a whole. Here's some examples of us as women in these spaces. But stereotypes have impacts on even thinking about how people come to the system of undergraduate engineering as well. When you ask kids to draw pictures of engineers, they often draw things like this. They draw pictures of people on manufacturing lines, or they might draw some really brilliant guy in a lab coat. And they're working on a problem and they have their light bulb idea of brilliance. And these stereotypes create boundaries that shape how people think about who can become an engineer and whether or not engineering is for them. And this persists, right, in a ton of areas. So we look at science and engineering occupations in the United States. This is the representation intersectionally by race and gender of who's in those spaces versus the US population. And I like this because often we talk about women broadly, or men broadly, or underrepresented racial and ethnic groups broadly, but there's a high variation depending on who you're talking about in these particular spaces. And a lot of my work is situated this question of, why is this the way it is? What systems shape this, and how might we think about opportunities to broad participation? So there's a lot of ways that people have thought about this really complex, thorny topic. How many of you have heard of the leaky pipeline as a metaphor? Handful of folks? Okay. So this is a metaphor that's a little bit older, and you see this is from the National Center for Education Statistics, used by a lot of people to think about this problem and this system. It's been critiqued for a lot of reasons. It treats people as fluids in a system. There's only one way in or out of the system, and it's only out. And anyone who has left an engineering or STEM pipeline is considered a leak. So this visual shows the declining engagement of women across high school to college, to majoring in STEM, and to STEM graduates, right? And so, women are treated as this little drip of water at the bottom. There's some problems here, right? It doesn't treat people as humans and agents in the system who have choice. And it kind of limits the way we think about the research questions that can be asked here. It's often very descriptive, numbers-based outcomes. So there's been other ways that people propose thinking systematically about this approach. Oops, sorry. One is to think about pathways. And so you'll see this is looking at who are graduates going into academic careers in engineering, and Sankey diagrams representing inflows and outflows. In this case, people are given a little bit more agency in how they're making choices. People are considering how pathways into engineering are shaped and out of engineering and why that might be. But it's still got some limitations in how we think about all of the potential factors that still kind of influence this thorny problem of broadening participation, and why honestly we've invested billions of dollars in this problem nationally and haven't quite seen much in the way of change on percentage basis of participation. So in more recent ways of thinking about how do we address this problem, I would say people have finally gotten to the idea of systems really matter, and we need to think about all the agents in the system. And so this is an ecosystem model to think about change and all of the different parts that are influencing why people are participating in engineering. And my work, I'm going to align this here today, is really thinking about how those micro level interactions within someone's own way of thinking about themselves in the world and decisions that they make are shaped by meso level factors like classroom environments and interpersonal interactions in teams and that office hour that you had with your professor, and the macro level things that are happening as well, like the professional bodies that tell us what it means to be a civil or a chemical engineer, our university policies, procedures, and practices, and the larger external environment. By understanding all these different factors in the system, we can actually start to create change because we understand which levers work in particular contexts. And so I'm going to just kind of map it to this. This is maybe just a more simplified version we've used in some of the papers we've written, thinking about identity specifically and how an individual thinks of themselves and how it's influenced by all these layered and nested environments within the system of undergraduate education. And I want to tell you about 3 studies today. We'll try to squeeze it in here. So I want to talk about my career award because I think, first, I invested a lot of my time in that. That was actually with COVID 7 years of my life as a researcher. So most of my life as a faculty member was engaged in my career award. And we found some really interesting things about identity and how it's shaped by classroom contexts and environments and engineering culture more broadly. I want to talk about an ecological belonging intervention that we designed and are testing the mechanisms for how it might influence student outcomes in the classroom context and interacting with learner identity. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about some emerging work. So, still sorting through the details of it around curricular complexity. So that kind of college level structure and how we say students have to migrate through pathways in engineering and how that shapes sense of self and other types of outcomes. So I've bandied about the word identity for a while, but I think it's important for us to define it because that's a word we use in everyday life, but it has particular meaning and theoretical underpinnings that matter in my work. All right, so I think of identity as the answer to 3 core questions. Who am I as a person? And there might be lots of answers to that depend on the context you're in. Who can I be? Where am I going? What is that ultimate future outcome? And where do I belong? And the answer to those things guide a ton of stuff that we care about in education. It influences retention, recruitment, academic success, well-being, and a number of other outcomes that kind of really impact the ways we think about what education is doing or not doing for students and how people are participating or not in engineering. And so identity is this dynamic process. So it not only is multiply layered and depending on where people are, but it also has a temporal component here that makes it both A, very interesting for me to study, but also very challenging. And it's formed through this dynamic interplay of the individual and structures. And so you can think of it as an individual has this way of thinking about themselves in the world, and they agentically take action, pursue a thing, answer a question in class, and there's something in the environment, whether that's other people, policies, practices, procedures, values, and cultural norms that then constrain or enable how that person is positioned in that space. And by constraining or enable, it reshapes the internal dialogue that someone might have about themselves as an engineer, for example, and reshapes how they might push back on or change their own perceptions of themselves moment to moment and then over time. And so, again, you might be wondering why this matters, but to me, this is a fundamental question of human development, because who you are and how you see yourself in the world has been connected to so many things. And so, if you're like, well, I don't really care about what's going on in people's head, it's been connected to other things like how people set goals and pursue them, how they feel like they belong. And as I mentioned, it's been connected to a number of other things. If you're curious about exploring this, I got lots of sites. I'm not going to fit them on the screen here. But all the things that we kind of see at the big headlines about education and the challenges we're facing are addressed in some way, shape, or form through thinking about these fundamental things that are hard to measure, happen invisibly sometimes in your head, and are shaped by these layers of complex systems. All right, so let's dive in. Like, what does this actually look like in real life? So I started this career award based on my early identity work, where I'd really just focused on the individual, and I had just really focused on thinking about identity, like what influences it for each person. And one of the big conversations at that point in time was thinking about what is the argumentation for DEI in that space, diversity, equity, inclusion. And there are some conversations around, well, engineering has opportunities for economic and social mobility. Everyone should have similar opportunities to access that. And I think that is an incredibly important conversation to be having. That's a social justice case for DEI. There's also the case that folks were making that, well, it's a business case. More diversity equals better engineering. More diversity equals companies that make more money. More diversity equals positive, innovative outcomes. And the thing is that those are really not the same argument, but yet often they have been lumped together in very specific kinds of ways. And I think, again, they're both very important pieces, but the ways in way people were asking these questions didn't really understand how the undergraduate education shaped the particularly business case side of things. And the hypothesis I had, it was based on a little bit of literature, was I think our undergraduate engineering degree programs actually homogenize students' innovations and ways of thinking rather than create opportunities for more creativity. So I wondered about that and the opportunity to ask that question. So the basis of the career award was really thinking about latent diversity, or the underlying attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets, ways of being, thinking, and knowing that students brought with them already that we may not notice or value in engineering. We say an engineer is like this, your curriculum looks like this. What does that do to all of that sets of assets that folks are showing up with, and are we really valuing them in the way we do education? And so I think this is a helpful visual to think about when we do this kind of work, the different kinds of questions we might ask in our approaches. A lot of times, a traditional approach to asking these kinds of questions first takes people and puts them into bins by their demographic categories: women, non-binary, men, or race, ethnicity, or first-generation college student status, or a number of other things, and then looks for differences that might exist and say we need to design for that. There's some benefits to that, right? There are real differences in experiences that those students have, and the literature supports that strongly. But what it didn't do is understand how people were more alike than different in those spaces, and how different experiences might shape those attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets that folks are showing up with. And so we said, what if we figured out the patterns in those underlying characteristics first, and then looked to see if there were patterns by demographic characteristics? Could we learn something different that's more aligned with this business case that folks are making? Does that argument actually hold up, and what might we do differently in education because of it? And then we want to say, well, then what does the undergraduate education then do for those underlying ways of being, thinking, and knowing over time? Do we homogenize our students or not? And what does that mean about the processes that they take? So we asked a couple of core questions here. What patterns exist? Then how do they develop identities over time, and what supports could be used to better shape their engineering experiences? And so we started by saying we want to just understand what exists. So we did a nationally representative survey of first-year engineering programs across the United States. 32 ABET accredited institutions are participating and represented in these data. We stratified this by engineering enrollment, so small engineering schools, medium, and large, to avoid having only the really, really big state schools dominating the data or a bunch of small institutions. And in this data, we had 3,711 responses. So we looked for attention checks and other things to make sure these were like truly folks were engaged with the survey. And we measured 17 different factors of these underlying attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets. I don't know if anyone does social science research. This is hard. 7,000 responses on it, or 3,700 responses on a survey is a lot of work. It took 6 months to recruit for these data, even though it's smaller than maybe some of the data that many of you are doing. And you can see here the home zip codes of students who are represented in the survey. And you might look at that and go, that doesn't look very nationally representative. That's a fair question. If we overlay the 2010 US Census data on top of this, you can actually see that the demographic density of the United States is actually well represented by the data that we have here. So I'm making the argument, this is data that can tell us generally what we see in engineers broadly. And then we used a data technique called topological data analysis to understand the underlying structures of these 17 factors in relation to one another in the data. All right, so how does this work? Well, if you think of 3 dimensions, because that's all I can really wrap my head around in real life, imagine you have a point cloud that's like a hand, right? We as humans are very good at recognizing patterns. You would recognize a hand shape if it looked like this, or if the fingers were folded up in some different ways. We're really good at doing that, right? And if you work in image processing or image recognition with AI, like that's a big thing that people are working on these days. But understanding our data structures is something that is a little bit more challenging. And so what this does is, if you think of this hand, it actually colors the data by a filter value. For us, this was density of response. So how close together was a student's response to other students using a k-nearest neighbors density estimate? Because we understand, are there more similar or different underlying attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets for these data? And then the data are sliced by this filter value. For us, we looked at overlap of groups and then at least 100 students in every slice, because it allowed us to then do subsequent follow-on statistical analyses sample size-wise. And then a hierarchical clustering technique with a single linkage that then created this 2D projection of this 3D data that maintained that connectivity and underlying structure. And there's a lot of tuning that was involved with this, but ultimately, what we did by using this was create a really useful 2D projection of highly dimensional data that we could then use to investigate the questions that we had. Now, to my knowledge, this is the first application of this technique in social science. It's been used in oncology studies to understand how gene expression is connected to certain kinds of cancer. It's been used in political party voting and affiliation and underlying beliefs about that. It's been used in, there's a really great TED talk on basketball positions and statistics and how our traditional ways of thinking about basketball positions aren't actually reflective of the way players play. But really the first time this has been applied in a social science context in the kinds of questions we were asking. And the data came out like this. I'm going to tell you how to interpret it. So blue here is less dense. So if you think about each of these nodes as a set of students, the student response patterns across those 17 dimensions are more diffuse in those larger circles. There's more of them and also less closely connected. The edges in this network are connected by students who have membership across those nodes. So students are kind of spread attitudinally, like taking the data and almost smearing it into this 2D projection. And then we can use these progressions, so they're not discrete groups like a cluster analysis, to investigate parts of the map and understand what are those underlying attitudes and beliefs there, how are they similar to one another within that space in the network, and then what does that then mean for thinking about who these students are over time in engineering education. And so we call group A kind of our largest and more heterogeneous group as far as they're more similar to one another than other areas of the map. You can kind of see that as the display happens in some of those other nodes. And they look a lot more like the traditional engineer as far as the underlying attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets they're showing up with. So when we benchmark these data against existing studies, they look like your average values for an engineer across the 17 dimensions. These other areas that start to get further away from that group are smaller. The students are more similar in their patterns to one another, and they have very and statistically significant different types of underlying attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets that occur. And when we looked at these data, one of the interesting things about this is we're preserving the whole person in the data. So a lot of studies in engineering ed have looked at variables, like identity as an individual variable, motivation as an individual variable. This allows the whole person in the data to be preserved. So we're studying people rather than variables, which creates new kinds of opportunities for research questions. And then when we dug into this further, and we said, well, you know, where are the women in the map? Are they different? Where are the first gen students in the map? Are they different? The answer actually turned out to be no. They are equally distributed across these different areas, which maybe flips some of the questions about barriers and support in engineering on its head. Interesting thing enough too is when we took these data, we did our traditional approaches of demographics and then differences, we did find them. So again, the kinds of questions you ask in the data analyses can answer different things. And when we look at these progressions over time, they are predictive of retention in engineering and engineering identity development. Students in Group A are more likely to persist in engineering. They look like the more traditional engineer. And they're more likely to have stronger identities in engineering, meaning the environment and system of engineering education benefits these folks the most. And everybody else may not have as much of what they need, which is an opportunity space. So we didn't just do this quantitatively because this only answers certain kinds of questions for us. We did it qualitatively as well. And so in this case, we sampled out of all of those groups and we wanted to understand how identities developed over time. We could do repeated survey measures, but it doesn't really give us the how and why that a qualitative study would give us. And so we asked students about their identity development intellectually as engineers, the content they're learning, how they're applying that in the world. We asked them about the institutional factors that were supporting that, and we asked them about their networks, the people they were interacting with and how that was shaping their identity development. You can see some definitions of these strands together. And we wanted to understand over 4.5 years, interviewing these students every semester, how did those identities change and how did those progressions maybe influence their pathways into engineering? I'm going to show you, that's a lot of data. I'm going to show you just a snippet of that. We use these elicitation tools in our interviews called journey maps, and we had students reflect before those interviews about what was their experience that previous semester and how did it influence their identity and talk about the high and low points over time. So here's an example from Anna. She's a white woman in electrical engineering, and she was in our normative group for engineering. And I just pulled out a highlighted quote here. And I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but she talked about the prior experiences she had to engineering, which looked a lot like the traditional course taking and experiences of most engineers. But she talked about how E&M, her electricity and magnetism course in physics, clicked for her. And physics sort of fell into a place, and I had that brilliant aha moment. Maybe there's a stereotype there about engineers, and it made me really feel like an expert. And I saw classes like electricity and magnetism in my college curriculum. I was like, I want to study engineering, because that's where science, design, math, and technology all meet up. And I feel like it's such a varied field, you can do whatever you want with it. This was the kind of normative experience of many engineers, and she was thriving in an education system, and in many points had more high points than low points over the board, and her identity was sustained through her experiences in engineering. John is an example of another student, and he talked a lot about his experiences as a native Hawaiian man in mechanical engineering, and he was in one of our smaller, more sparse, non-traditional data progressions. And he said things like, I have different classes, and he talked about how his professor was a support for him in that space. And he talked about how that created supports for him that he was not afraid to ask a question in class. And so it highlighted for us some opportunities for where we could think about who is influencing and what's important. But at the same time, if we looked at John's trajectory over the whole course of his engineering career, he felt like he had to norm to what it meant to be an engineer, and ultimately he didn't stay in engineering. So these are just 2 highlights of 40-something students we interviewed over 4.5 years, but it kind of illustrates how this technique allowed us to then investigate a question more deeply and in a different kind of way. So you might be like, well, so what? Great question. We identified very specific sets of faculty interactions, peer interactions, classroom and curricula in the systems of education, and co-curricular supports and institutional policies that can broadly support all engineering students and create ways to foster students from the non-dominant TDA data progression to succeed in engineering. And we've shared those nationally on our website and with a workshop for the American Society for Engineering Education if you're interested in learning more. Talk a little bit about ecological belonging intervention. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. That kind of laid a foundation for thinking about, okay, I know a little bit more about what's happening in the system of undergraduate education across those different layers. What can we do about it, and what things might we test to reshape those experiences of students and change the environments in which they're situated? All right, so we talked a little bit about stereotypes, but the mere existence of stereotypes is enough to cause negative outcomes. There's a ton of studies from psychology that demonstrate that, and if someone believes that others around them hold a negative stereotype about them, one that has been commonly tested is women are bad at math. That's not true. From a statistics standpoint and from a reality standpoint, but it's a stereotype that's often conveyed in K-12 education and even in undergraduate education space. And what happens is that they'll avoid fulfilling that stereotype in the moment. So studies in which there is no primed effect, students just take a really hard math exam, men and women do the same. The minute that that idea is primed, this test shows a gender difference. Don't say what direction that is. Women in that experimental condition perform much worse than men in that particular context. And the hypothesized mechanism for that is that if you've got stuff to be learned, your working memory only has so much space. And if you're worrying about endorsing a negative stereotype about your group, you're taking up some of that cognitive space. And you block the pathway into learning. And it negatively impacts a lot of downstream outcomes that impact students who are really important. And so then you've fulfilled a stereotype about your group, and then all of a sudden it may become a part of your identity. So how do we disrupt that is one of my questions. Well, it becomes particularly important when students are going through transition to address these types of stereotypes and engage them in engineering and support them in thinking that they are someone who can succeed and belong in those spaces. And gateway courses in particular are a space in STEM that has been studied and have demonstrated impacts. So in this figure, these are grade anomalies on the x-axis. So compared to your average grade in all your other courses, what's the impact of this course on your grade, GPA-wise, higher or lower than the average? And then the line on this x-axis is, on the y here is the gender performance difference. So if you're above the line, women are performing on average better than men. And if you're below the line, men are performing on average better than women. And this is a study across 172 different introductory STEM courses at 5 universities representing 677,000 students. The gray circles are your traditionally taught lecture-based courses across STEM. The blue courses are hybrid lecture and labs, and the orange courses are labs. So what you can see is on average labs, everyone performs similarly and they're a grade boost. The blue kind of fall in the middle, and then your traditionally taught lecture courses, which are often the largest courses, penalize everybody, but in particular, they penalize women more. Men are doing better than women. And so this, again, is something structural that we might need to think about and think about addressing. How do you tackle that? It's a big problem. And getting people to do things and change is also a big problem. So we wanted to try to address this equity gap through a lightweight intervention with instructors. So we define an academic equity gap as an outcome that is because there's something in the environment rather than something to fix in the students themselves. There's something in the space that's priming stereotypes or shaping messages about who can succeed and belong that we can start to poke on and change. It's not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems. For example, at the institution we are running this intervention at, this is the average set of students who've been admitted on their ACT and SAT scores, and all of them are really high achieving and have the ability to succeed, and yet we see continued equity gaps that show up in the data. Right? So we wanted to target courses where that was happening. We looked at an intro programming course in engineering because it's a huge gateway course for students. And we wanted to first look at, is there an equity gap we might be addressing? And so when we controlled for things like gender, race, ethnicity, first-gen college student status, high school GPA, and incoming SAT, ACT course scores, and instructor term to term, we found this persistent GPA gap for our Black, Latiné, and Indigenous students, almost half a GPA point performing lower than their peers in this class. Women, no equity gap showing up in the programming course. Right? So there's something going on here for our students who are underrepresented by race and ethnicity that we wanted to think about addressing. So in this study, we're answering a couple of core questions around the experiences of students and the effects of the belonging intervention. I'm going to focus on these three here. How does the belonging intervention change their feelings of belonging? How does it change their focus on GPA? We're still tracking some of the longitudinal data. And what are the effects of implementing the intervention on the instructors themselves? So we have a theory of how this might work, what the mechanism might be. But there's this classroom environment, generally what belonging and norms exist, and attitudes that students bring with them about their ability to grow and learn over time, their identities as individuals and engineers, their values for engineering, their interest in engineering as a subject, and their beliefs about their ability to succeed in engineering or self-efficacy. And we believe that if we can reshape this class engagement through an intervention, we can impact those attitudes, which then will change their performance outcomes and hopefully ultimately their persistence. But we wanted to be able to test that. So what did we do? Well, we wanted to convey the message here that typical adversity, adjustment to college, struggling in programming, classes heavily team-based, teams are hard, but that's a normal experience for all students and it's surmountable. So that hopefully students would say, it's not me and the stereotype about me, this is something everyone's going through and I can succeed over time. So how do we do this? Well, students were formed into teams. And the instructor introduces this idea that it can be easy to be overwhelmed or question if you belong here, and that everyone goes through struggle. He gives some examples. And then they share an experience of their own struggles in this moment to normalize that in the classroom. Then students are asked to reflect on a time when they succeeded and how they overcame a barrier. Then we share stories from previous students who took the course that emphasize an arc of struggle to an action within the student's locus of control to a resolution. And it doesn't mean, and then I got an A. And then I felt like maybe I belonged more in this space or that I could succeed or I got the supports I needed. And then there's some small group discussion and a class-wide discussion. About 40, 45 minutes in a class, single point in time in the first week of classes. Here's an example of one of those quotes. I like this one a lot because it's personalized from focus groups that we conducted with students. But it says, if you don't know anything about me, you don't know anything about coding like me, you're probably feeling like you did something wrong. You didn't. The class is just tough sometimes, and that's okay. You're more than capable to get through this. Stack Exchange is your friend. And don't be afraid to ask other groups for help and never think you're not good enough. Have faith in yourself and your teammates. Learn to rely on yourself sometimes, but you gotta have a support system, both academically, but more importantly, emotionally. You got this. Signed a fellow engineering idiot. Really simple. Did it have an impact? Well, we did this with students. The first round we did this was with about 691 students. Oh, yeah. And about half of them filled out the survey. Survey response rates are often in the 10 to 15% range, so pretty decent. And we had the post-survey completed in the last 2 weeks of classes. We also tracked their GPA and we're still tracking their persistence in engineering. And we can talk more about this, but the two things we wanted to look at here were really how did their belonging change and was it impacted over time in the pre and post analysis by the race ethnicity of the student and the treatment or control condition? And along with belonging, do we have an impact on their grade in the course? And in this case, the grades are pretty highly skewed towards the A- range, but we wanted to look at students particularly who might have failed the course, because that's a big block for success, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So what did we find? Well, when we looked at the belonging scores, this is low in, so it's work that is ongoing, and we're seeing these results replicated in other work where we're doing this with thousands of students now, is that students who were in the DLI group had a slight decline in their belonging over the semester in the control group, but a flat incoming pre-post compared to the intervention group. This is just statistically significant, but I had questions about whether or not this is a real effect or not, so we're again continuing to explore it. But in comparison to their white and Asian peers, that belonging didn't happen for either the control or treatment group. We had no effect. And again, the sample sizes are small in the BLI group, so you see the error bars are much larger. So that was interesting, but it raised questions about the mechanisms that we had proposed and whether or not they were actually working the way we thought. The very interesting and impactful thing was looking at student grades. So when we looked at student grades, our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are here in the lower bar, and this is the control group. On the left-hand side, you can see that equity gap shows up just like it did in the historic data over and over and over again. That gap is completely closed in the treatment group. So a one-time 45-minute intervention, beginning of the semester, completely changed grades with no other extra supports, no extra tutoring, no extra support courses, nothing different done on the role of the instructor, changed the messaging and the environment of the classroom, and it changed the outcome in the space. All right, so we're keeping on doing this work, and we've started to engage the faculty in thinking about training them on what we're doing and why they're doing it. Because one of the things that came out was fidelity seems to be a really important piece of this and how the instructor enacts this in the classroom environment. And what should we take away from that? Well, we think the intervention's acting as a buffering effect, but we're still exploring that mechanism because it seems like we don't have it quite down yet. And we need to think about the classroom context instructor and closing that academic equity gap completely. There's still some space there, particularly in summative assessments like prelims and exams that we can address. We're doing a lot of other data connections, but it seems the struggles are reframed beyond the course for many students, and in longitudinal analysis with interviews, we're seeing that and how women even make sense of persistence more broadly. So it's got downstream effects that don't seem to be just linked to race ethnicity in this one course. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we've lumped a bunch of groups of students together, which I don't love doing, but it's a power issue here that we're going to continue to work on as we gather more data. So we're going to talk one more thing, and then I'll wrap up with lots of time for questions, hopefully, because I hope we'll have a good, robust discussion. But I think some of that work in study 3 raised questions for me about then thinking, what are our gateway courses and how do they impact students? What are our requirements and do they change student outcomes? And so this is ongoing work. Like some of these figures were generated in the last week, but I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things we're doing here at Cornell. So this is the major pathway diagram for chemi. I'm going to throw chemi under the bus because I feel like I can. I call this the spaghetti diagram. This is basically all the semesters for graduation, and co and prereqs are shown with arrows and lines here. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of required courses. The chemi curriculum is pretty rigid, and it's packed. There are only opportunities for 7 electives in the entire curriculum, and they're all concentrated except for one in the senior year. Maybe you think that's a problem, maybe you don't. I wanted to ask that question. So one of the things we're using is something called curricular complexity metrics, and they use network metrics to start to investigate how the structures we have in curriculum might shape student experiences. We use 3 of these factors. One is called the delay factor. This is basically the longest path of courses that a failure in a course would delay. And so you can see on the top one, right, these are all in a path of 3, whereas this one is in a path of 2 courses. The blocking factor is how many courses subsequently that course blocks from being able to be taken based on co and prerequisites. So you can see this one's 3, 1, 2, and 3 courses, 2 here for these 2, and so on. And then the centrality factor is how many other upstream and downstream courses that it's connected to along a path. So like 3 is here connected to this one before it and after it, but it also is connected to this course over here. Whereas this course here in the second curriculum is connected to this one before and after. There's also a path through it for these other 2 courses as well. These tell us different things about the networks of curriculums that we can explore. And we can combine these to different things. The one that's commonly used in the literature is this course cruciality, which is the sum of the delay factor and the blocking factor. Really kind of how central this is for progression through the curriculum. We're also thinking about a course significance index that accounts for all of these together because centrality is also a really important metric here. And typically folks are summing the course cruciality to come up with a total curricular complexity metric. Just some addition here. And when we start to look at the curriculum at Cornell, in CBE, we can see some differences in our courses. So don't worry about the left-hand side, that's just all the list of names. But what I think is interesting is when we can start to look at the median values for the curriculum and what stands out as really important courses. Courses that are really essential to the student career pathway, and then we can start to dig in and say, what's going on there? Is there an academic equity gap? Is everyone succeeding the same way? Are there opportunities to change or reshape those experiences for students? And that's kind of where we're at this point in time. But you can see this course has 4 really important courses with a handful that are above the mean. A lot of courses that aren't as important, often gateway or intro courses because they're earlier on in the sequence. And we can start to look across the disciplines as well. So you can see here the dots are representing the crucial courses that show up well above that median, a standard deviation above the median, as well as the average value on that course significance index. And a couple stand out as particularly important. The MAE course sequence is dominated by statics and dynamics. Those are areas that we need to think about, those in particular for success along that pathway. Chemi has got a lot of them, but they're consistently in the same place, and it looks pretty similar to a number of other courses. CS has the lowest curricular complexity. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's got a lot of different electives engaged in that particular space. And so this is opportunity for future work and stuff we're working on. We're currently doing Monte Carlo simulations on how a change in those required structures affect the sensitivity of those metrics. Folks are just using them without, I think, critically asking, what are these measures actually changing in the moment and how are they impacting the outcomes we care about? So can we change those things and understand what the measure is actually getting us more information about? We're also working on thinking about connecting those not only to retention and time to degree, but a number of other student outcomes like these academic equity gaps and major affiliation, which are often big open questions here at Cornell. And then ultimately, I hope we can answer questions around, do our education systems create disparate impacts for different groups in engineering, and what can we do about it? How can we take the curriculum complexity and then think about what that means about that classroom environment along with that ecological belonging intervention that I worked on a little bit previously, and even what's happening at the individual student level to think about ways in which we shape our educational systems and environments for equity and broadening participation. I'm going to stop there, and I hope we can have some questions about this. I struggled to pick a handful of the things we're working on. This is just scratching the surface, but hopefully a good idea of how we're connecting the individual in an environment to the larger curricular structures and education systems that we have here at Cornell and beyond. So thanks everyone for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, we have time for questions. Anyone?
Please.
When you were talking about the significance index in the courses, when you were doing the network map, that's based on the amount of courses that they block, or that's a conceptual conceptual significance that you assign to?
So this is based on the summation of the centrality factor, the blocking factor, and the delay factor. Folks have really looked at that course cruciality as the only thing, but they've also only looked at time to graduation and major retention, like at engineering broadly. And so we're asking questions, can we dive a little bit deeper? It's not in here. I have a grant due on Tuesday, but we're using this information to potentially radically rethink the way we do Chemi at Cornell, which is an exciting opportunity. We've had lots of conversations about that required curriculum and what would it look like to think about a more flexible curriculum that creates space to explore multiple different applications and futures. That's, I think, a really amazing opportunity, and one that is surprising to me that we have here, because Chemi as a field, right, has not changed the curriculum nationally in about 80 to 100 years. And our curriculum in Chemi looks almost identical to many other chemical engineering curriculums everywhere else. Like, it's pretty canonically, it's this course sequence at this university and that university. Rankings don't matter, it's pretty consistent. There's a handful of exceptions, but I think we have an opportunity to lead in that space, which is fun as well. Great question. Gina.
Very interesting presentation. Beyond your discipline of chemical engineering, do you see how your research could impact STEM-wide disciplines and make any, improvement in terms of DEI enhanced curriculum?
Yeah, I think there are tons of implications. I'll say most of my work is actually at the engineering broad level, although we know that disciplines are very different. And so I say my move to Cornell has actually precipitated more chemical engineering specific work. But a lot of the gateway courses in particular that we think about are for STEM majors broadly: chemistry, physics, mathematics, organic chemistry, just in a gen chem. And some other work I didn't talk about here because it's not engineering specific is looking at belonging intervention across a number of those other courses and spaces, so it has implications there. But I also, when I think about identity as an engineer, it's intimately entwined with mathematics identity, science identity, and so there's sharing that's happening across those spaces around what works here. Sometimes it's contextually unique, and other times it's more broadly applicable across STEM in general. So yeah, I think there is crosstalk that's really important, and especially if you look kind of further out towards the K-12 level, I think folks are not as well narrowly defined as they get along the educational pathway. So stuff that works early is often more STEM focused, and then it becomes more specific as you get into undergrad and graduate education. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think the answer is yes, generally, is a short answer with all of that editorial added on.
So there was an editorial in The Sun last week about Cornell becoming a tech campus. How important is broadening the outlook of all of these engineers?
I will speak from my personal perspective on that. My prior institution was the second largest percentage of STEM majors in the country, behind Georgia Tech. And it was not a tech school, it was a university. And I think that was to the detriment of many of our students because they were so narrowly focused on the technical solutions that they hadn't really thought about the human side of this in the world. And one of the things that I really love about the Cornell education is it does require, I think, a broad set of questions and applications, and I would want us to think about that as we move forward. There are forces at play. I see an app hat on, right? Like the megafab in clay is coming, and in many ways folks have said in different editorials that it might be the next Silicon Valley in upstate New York. It's an exciting opportunity to be engaged in that space, but I think we've got to think really broadly and not narrowly about how we train our engineers towards that end. That's my 2 cents. For whatever they're worth, maybe not even 2 cents.
So Allison, you look at this complexity, the curriculum complexity. So after you're able to categorize or measure this complexity, do you want to link this complexity to what kind of outcomes?
Yeah, so we're in the process of getting student transcript records and admissions records. I would love to be able to merge that with survey data as well. That gets us some of these other things. But I think as a first pass, those data are available and I don't have to collect them. I have to just get permission to access them. I'd like to look at those crucial courses. And I'd like to say, well, are they having these great anomaly impacts for all students or for particular groups of students? Do we need to think critically with those faculty about what that means, about the classroom structures and environments there that maybe are having unintended consequences that we weren't even aware of? And then there's larger questions around how does this map not just to Cornell, but more broadly on a national scale about the ways we think about doing undergraduate engineering education. So as a first pass, institutional data, but then maybe broader than that.
I think this is so meaningful and important because as you mentioned, you took CB as an example, like the curriculum has not changed for 60 or 80 years. Right, of course, this morning, the president was having the meeting, right? So the Cornell conference was having the meeting. And the one key thing that was discussed was really cross-disciplinary education. So you see that on one hand, we have these rigid department curriculums that are so complicated, very dated, if not outdated, very dated. And on the other hand, for example, at least the Cornell president is talking about this cross-disciplinary education. I was wondering how your research in the future can help define the future curriculums
Yeah, I hope we'll be able to speak to that in a couple of years and really have some definitive answers. I think it's a really hard and fine line. Like we've been having these, I don't know if they're discussions or arguments as the faculty in Chemie right now because of this grant that we're working on together. But in some ways, there's some core timeless fundamentals that like every chemical engineer needs, and yet the possibilities of where they go and who they work with and what interdisciplinary applications are done are opening broader and broader and broader. And so it's a question of like, you can't just pack the curriculum more, right? You can't add more credit hours. We can't say, oh, an undergrad degree is 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, or require everyone to go on to a master's degree. I don't think those are the directions we should go. So what is core, what is timeless, what is essential? Can we even agree on that as a starting point? What are the learning progressions to get to those core things, and like how much does that take up space-wise? And how do you create more flexibility to do this more interdisciplinary work or allow people to do more exploration? And yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I don't have a lot of existing models for how to even navigate that, but I'm excited to think about that and build it. And my colleague, I'll put a pitch in for her, Alexandra Kosostrong, is a partner in that process, right? And so I'm much more focused on the changes themselves and how they're impacting students, and she's much more thinking about what is the studies we can do of the change process, and how does that inform models for change in addressing these topics, which I think is a different set of questions that we'll be able to answer, hopefully, if we're successful as well.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
I mean, you talked a lot about a lot of your research was in like undergraduate studies. Have you ever thought about taking this to like the K through 12 level? Because I mean, first the leaky pipeline, like a lot of it was at the like K through 12 level, and then also like we were talking about the example you used was saying women are bad at math, and that affected women negatively, like performance-wise. I almost, in like personal experience, remember that more like in grade school and like those ages, and how that would affect.
Yeah, and it's definitely a constant question, right? Because like there's already folks who have made decisions that STEM is not for me, engineering is not for me, way earlier. Middle school is actually a critical time point in the literature that shows up. I don't know if my work's gonna go there. There's a couple reasons. One, how many people have to engage with the institutional review board? I'll tell you a little bit about that briefly. So working with humans, anyone else who works with animals also, and then people who are doing like drug trial treatments or blood draws or things like that, we have a different set of ethical responsibilities because of the people we're engaging in those research studies, and so we have to put everything forward to the review board ahead of time. And the K-12 students are a protected population because they're minors, right? Obviously, that's an important consideration, and so the process of doing research becomes much more challenging at that level. But also there's been a lot of work in STEM education broadly from colleges of education, often at the K-12 level. And so one of the things I think that's interesting about engineering education and distinguishes it from STEM education and college of education is most of those folks are trained science and mathematics teachers that then become faculty and professors that train the next generation of science and mathematics teachers. We need partnerships with those folks, but I think that engineering technical knowledge that an engineering education person brings married with the social science sometimes has more specific direct applications to like undergrad or grad education. I have colleagues who work with K-12 students, but I do think it's important, right? Like there's other people doing that work to learn from them and continue to speak to each other as we think about who's showing up in the college space, and then what are the upstream impacts of what's happening in the K-12 classroom to address those things as well. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. Any other questions?
Great. I think it's right. The time. So let's thank Allison. Thank you. That's a great talk.
Thank you.